In the heart of the wilderness, where nature's beauty intertwines with its ferocity, 6 harrowing tales unfold, each a chilling reminder of the unpredictable encounters between humans and grizzly bears. From a small Alaskan clinic turned battleground to a tranquil camping trip that spirals into chaos, these stories reveal the fragility of safety in the wild. As unsuspecting individuals confront the raw power of nature, the consequences are devastating and profound. Join us as we explore these gripping narratives, each one a testament to the thin line between adventure and survival in the untamed landscapes of North America. Togiak, an isolated village on the southwestern coast of Alaska, was a place where the natural world and human life coexisted in a delicate balance. The village, home to fewer than 1,000 residents, had no road access, and the harsh winters posed a constant threat to survival. The only medical facility, a small, aging clinic, stood at the heart of Togiak, serving as a refuge for those in need of care. The doctors who worked in the clinic were accustomed to the challenges posed by the remote location, but no one could have predicted the terror that would unfold on December 8, 2024. Winter arrived early that year, with December bringing heavy snowstorms and biting winds that chilled the village to its core. Residents stayed close to home, minimizing travel, while wildlife faced a harsher challenge. For grizzly bears, the early snow disrupted their hibernation, forcing many to leave their dens prematurely in search of food. One such bear, driven by hunger and relentless storms, ventured farther than ever before. Togiak, usually too small and remote for most wildlife to find, became an unexpected destination. The bear, hungry and disoriented, made its way into the village. The air was thick with snow as the bear lumbered through the outskirts of the settlement, its paws heavy and deliberate in the fresh powder. As it neared the clinic, it was drawn to the warmth emanating from the building, a stark contrast to the frigid cold outside. Its instincts, honed over years of survival, led it toward the unfamiliar yet tempting warmth. With a final push, the bear squeezed through a loosely secured door that led into the clinic's emergency room. Inside, chaos erupted. Dr. Emily Carter, a 34-year-old emergency physician, was the first to hear the unmistakable sound of heavy thuds echoing from the bear's footsteps. At first, she thought it might be a large moose, but as the door to the emergency room slammed open, the source of the sound revealed itself in a burst of terror. The grizzly, disoriented and terrified by the confined space, crashed into the room. The air was thick with panic, as the bear's presence triggered a visceral response from the clinic's staff. Though the bear was disoriented, its instincts were clear. It was desperate and confused, driven by a deep-seated fear as well as hunger. Dr. Jacob Palmer, 40, a seasoned veteran of the clinic, had just finished a consultation with a patient when the bear stormed in. The emergency room, designed to handle minor injuries and illnesses in a place far removed from larger hospitals, was not prepared for the onslaught of such a powerful, unpredictable creature. The bear's immense size dwarfed the room, and its wild eyes swept across the clinic's interior. Staff scrambled for any means of defense, but the clinic lacked the proper deterrence or tools to handle such an extreme threat. There were no firearms or tranquilizers, only a small assortment of medical supplies that would be useless in the face of a bear's rage. The first few moments were a blur. The bear, sensing movement, lashed out with its enormous claws, swiping at anyone within reach. Dr. Carter, positioned closest to the door, had no time to react before the bear's massive paw struck her across the chest, sending her crashing into a nearby desk. The other doctors, including Dr. Palmer, attempted to push the animal back, trying to shield the helpless patients in the clinic. But the bear's strength was overwhelming, and its rage was palpable. The attack was swift and brutal. The bear's jaws snapped, finding their mark on Dr. Palmer's leg. The sheer force of the bite was enough to tear through muscle and bone, and Dr. Palmer screamed in pain, his body crumpling under the animal's weight. Other staff members scrambled to escape, but the clinic was too small, and the bear's unpredictable movements made it impossible to avoid its grasp. Dr. Carter, struggling to breathe from the force of her injuries, tried to crawl away, but her body was already failing her. Another doctor, Dr. Miriam Henson, managed to grab a chair, attempting to use it as a shield, but the bear knocked it aside with a single swipe, its claws tearing through the wooden frame as if it were paper. Her arm was immediately maimed, leaving her vulnerable to the bear's next attack. The animal turned on her, sinking its teeth into her shoulder and dragging her across the room with terrifying ease. Dr. Henson's scream echoed through the building, a sound that was cut short as the bear's massive paw crushed her ribcage. The other two doctors, Dr. James Turner and Dr. Linda Matthews, were unable to help. In the chaos, they too were caught in the bear's rampage. Dr. Turner attempted to block the bear's path with a metal stretcher, but the bear knocked it aside with such force that it flew into the far corner of the room. In seconds, the bear was on him, its claws raking across his face and torso, leaving deep, ragged wounds. Dr. Matthews, in a desperate attempt to flee, ran for the back exit, but the bear's enormous bulk blocked her path, and she too fell victim to the attack, her body being violently tossed aside like a rag doll. The entire scene lasted only a few minutes, but it felt like an eternity. The bear, having maimed all 5 doctors, seemed to lose interest as its initial frenzy wore off. It retreated toward the back of the clinic, where it finally collapsed from exhaustion, its own confusion perhaps overtaking its aggression. But the damage had been done. The villagers, alerted by the sounds of screams and the crash of furniture, arrived too late to prevent the carnage. Local authorities, with the help of a skilled hunter, soon tracked the bear down. The animal was eventually killed, its body found near the outskirts of the village. But by the time help arrived, all 5 doctors had been fatally mauled. The aftermath of the attack was swift and devastating. The loss of the clinic's entire medical staff plunged the small village into a state of shock and mourning. Discussions about wildlife management and safety measures for remote healthcare settings became immediate priorities. The clinic's lack of preparation, no bear deterrents, no firearms, no plans for such a catastrophe, was a glaring weakness that could no longer be ignored. The tragedy spurred debates on how to better protect those who lived and worked in the remote corners of the world, where humanity and nature often collided in unpredictable ways. The Canadian Rockies, with their jagged peaks and dense forests, were a realm of raw beauty and wilderness. The rugged terrain, winding rivers, and high meadows made it ideal for solitude and adventure. Sarah and Mark Bennett, both in their late 20s, were seasoned outdoor explorers. After weeks of planning, they set off on a remote camping trip to a secluded spot deep in the Rockies, far from the usual trails and campsites. They sought peace, away from civilization. Arriving at their site, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines next to a winding river, they found the landscape stunning, the air crisp, and the sky glowing in the sunset's warm hues. As they set up camp, they followed safety protocols, storing food in a bear-resistant container and hanging scented items high in a tree. Familiar with the area's wildlife risks, especially grizzly bears, they felt confident in their preparations. With the tent up and a small fire crackling, they settled in, content with their choice to explore this wild corner of the Rockies. As the night deepened, the sounds of the forest around them intensified. The chirping of cricket, the rustle of leaves in the wind, and the occasional hoot of an owl filled the air, creating a soundtrack to the wilderness that made them feel more connected to the world around them. Sarah and Mark enjoyed a simple dinner, their laughter and conversation blending with the peaceful atmosphere. They felt completely isolated, but in a comforting way, cut off from the world yet in tune with the natural rhythms of the environment. However, unbeknownst to them, they had camped in a location frequented by wildlife, and the food-scented air had drawn the attention of a grizzly bear. The bear, a massive creature, had been foraging in the nearby woods and caught wind of the couple's presence. Hungry and driven by instinct, it was instinctively drawn toward the scent of their food. As the night's darkness settled in, the grizzly made its way toward the camp, its massive form blending seamlessly into the shadowy forest. The first sign of trouble came when the forest's usual noises ceased. The chirping of crickets stopped suddenly, and the rustle of leaves grew faint. Sarah, who had just finished cleaning the small dishes by the campfire, felt a sudden prickling tension in the air. Mark, sensing something was amiss, stood up and began scanning the darkening woods. He squinted into the shadows, unable to see what was lurking just out of sight. They had both heard stories of bear sightings in the area, but they had hoped their precautions would ensure their safety. The bear, drawn by the scent of food, appeared silently from the trees, emerging at the edge of their camp with alarming speed. At first, it was only a shadow, its massive body moving with surprising stealth for such a large animal. But as the bear's silhouette took form in the flickering light of the campfire, its size became undeniable. Mark, realizing the danger, acted quickly. He grabbed a nearby pot and banged it against a metal pan, hoping to scare the animal away with noise. His heart raced as he stepped closer to the bear, his movements fast and erratic, trying to create enough of a disturbance to drive it off. But the grizzly, agitated and hungry, did not retreat. Instead, it charged, its eyes wide with the predatory focus of an animal defending its territory or searching for food. Mark barely had time to react before the bear was upon him. With terrifying force, the grizzly knocked him to the ground, its massive paws swiping across his chest and face. The shock of the impact left Mark stunned, and he was unable to protect himself from the onslaught. The bear's powerful claws raked through his clothes and skin, tearing into his body with primal strength. His head struck the ground hard, knocking him unconscious as the grizzly continued its assault. Sarah screamed in horror, frozen for a moment in shock at the sight of the bear overpowering Mark. The world seemed to slow as she watched the animal mauling her partner, helplessness gripping her tightly. But the instinct for survival kicked in quickly, and Sarah, her heart pounding, turned and bolted from the campsite. She ran, her legs moving faster than she had ever thought possible as her mind raced. She had to get help. She had to get out of the bear's reach. She ran through the dense forest, her feet pounding against the uneven ground, branches snapping as she brushed past them in her desperate flight. The cold air stung her lungs as she pushed herself harder, the distance between her and the camp growing with each stride. She didn't dare look back. Her focus was solely on reaching the ranger station several miles away. The fear and panic fueled her legs, the terror of knowing that Mark was in grave danger and that she was the only one who could get help. The sound of her breath was drowned out by the beating of her heart as she ran into the night. Hours later, Sarah reached the ranger station, exhausted and barely composed. Alerted by her distress, the rangers quickly formed a rescue team and headed for the campsite, hoping to save Mark. But by the time they arrived, it was too late. The bear had already gone, leaving Mark's lifeless, mauled body behind. Authorities tracked the bear through scent markers and prints, following its trail deep into the forest. After a tense standoff, wildlife officers euthanized the animal, acting out of instinct rather than malice. The bear's aggression had been triggered by the camp's proximity, the food scent, and Mark's presence. While necessary for public safety, the bear's death did not undo the tragedy. Mark Bennett's death, in the prime of his life, devastated Sarah and the community. The incident sparked discussions on bear safety, highlighting the importance of proper food storage in bear country. Experts warned that while grizzly encounters were rare, camping near feeding grounds increased the risk. Proper precautions, such as using bear-proof containers and keeping food away from campsites, were essential. Scarred by her loss, Sarah worked to raise awareness about safety in bear territory. The lessons from that night in the Canadian Rockies stayed with her, and she dedicated herself to ensuring that Mark's death would not be in vain, urging others to respect the wilderness and its wildlife. Jack Milligan had always been drawn to the wild, to the vast, untamed landscapes where nature reigned supreme. At 45, he was no stranger to the outdoors, an experienced hiker with a deep respect for the wilderness. His choice for this particular trip was a park in the northwestern part of Wyoming, a rugged expanse of jagged peaks, alpine lakes, and dense forests. Jack had hiked alone in remote areas before, priding himself on his ability to navigate the unpredictable challenges of the wild. The park, with their towering granite spires and crystal-clear streams, seemed like the perfect place for another solo adventure. He had spent several days traversing the park, marveling at the breathtaking scenery, the quiet stillness broken only by the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant cry of an eagle. Jack was well versed in the risks of hiking in bear country, particularly in the presence of grizzly bears. He always took the necessary precautions, keeping a safe distance from known bear habitats. ensuring his food was stored properly and staying alert at all times. Yet despite all his precautions, nothing could have prepared him for the encounter that would change the course of his life. It was mid-afternoon when Jack reached a quiet, secluded stream that wound its way through the valley. The water flowed gently over smooth stones, creating a peaceful, rhythmic sound that blended with the rustling of the wind through the trees. Needing a break, Jack paused to drink from his water bottle and rest for a moment on a nearby rock. The area seemed tranquil and untouched, as though the world had stopped moving. He allowed himself a brief moment of peace, appreciating the solitude of the moment. The surrounding forest was thick, the dense underbrush creating a wall of green that blocked the view beyond the stream. Jack's senses were heightened as he listened to the sounds of the wilderness, but nothing seemed out of place. Little did he know, he was not alone. From the dense woods, a rustle suddenly caught his attention. His eyes snapped toward the sound, scanning the trees, but at first, he saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of dark brown fur. His heart skipped a beat as he realized the shape was too large to be anything but a bear. A grizzly, enormous and powerful, stepped into the clearing, its eyes locked on him. Jack froze, his body instinctively tensing as his mind raced to process the situation. He knew that grizzly bears were territorial and protective of their young, but he hadn't expected to encounter one so close to his path. The bear, appearing as if it had emerged from the dense woods to the west, didn't hesitate. It was likely that the bear had sensed Jack's presence long before he saw it, the scent of human blood reaching its nostrils. As Jack's brain scrambled to think of a way to defuse the situation, the bear's gaze shifted toward him, its posture becoming more rigid. Jack's instincts screamed at him to retreat, but before he could even begin to move, the bear charged. There was no warning, no time to react. The massive creature surged forward with terrifying speed, its muscles rippling under its thick fur. Jack barely had time to register what was happening before the bear slammed into him, knocking him off his feet with brutal force. The world seemed to spin as he crashed to the ground, the air forced out of his lungs in a sharp gasp. His body hit the rocky terrain, pain shooting through his chest and limbs as the grizzly's enormous paws swiped at him. The bear's claws tore through his clothing and flesh with horrifying precision. Jack's heart pounded in his chest as the bear continued its assault, sinking its claws into his torso and back, its jaws snapping dangerously close. Desperation surged within him, and with every ounce of strength, Jack scrambled to protect himself, trying to push the bear away. But the bear's power was overwhelming, and no matter how hard he fought, the grizzly's sheer size and strength pinned him to the ground. The bear's mauling was relentless, each swipe like a hammer. Jack's breath grew shallow as the pain intensified, and he realized his chances of escaping were fading. In a moment of clarity, he remembered the advice: play dead. It was his last hope that the bear might lose interest and retreat. Despite his battered body, Jack forced himself to remain still, closing his eyes and bracing for the worst. The bear continued its assault, but as Jack lay motionless, it seemed to lose some of its aggression. It sniffed him, its hot breath washing over him. Jack fought through the pain, focusing on his breath as hours stretched endlessly. Eventually, the bear backed off, watching him before lumbering back into the trees. Jack, broken and unable to move, knew he needed help. Summoning all his strength, he weakly called out. His faint cries reached a group of hikers nearby, who rushed to his aid. They called for help, and soon park rangers arrived, administering first aid and airlifting him to a hospital. The bear was tracked and euthanized by wildlife officers due to the threat it posed. Authorities believed the bear had been protecting its cubs when it attacked. While the bear's behavior was natural, the incident highlighted the dangers of hiking in bear country, especially near young cubs. Jack survived, but the recovery was long and painful. Extensive surgery repaired the damage, and months of rehabilitation followed. His ordeal raised awareness about the risks of solo hiking in bear habitats. A park in southern Alaska, known for its breathtaking landscapes and abundant wildlife, was familiar ground for lifelong friends Derek and Tyler. Seasoned fishermen, they had spent countless days fishing the park's rivers and streams, always mindful of nature's power and the ever-present wildlife. Yet on that summer afternoon by a remote river, they could not have foreseen the danger that lay ahead. The river's rushing waters and the hum of nature created a tranquil backdrop as the friends cast their lines, pulling in salmon after salmon. They had spent hours fishing, confident in their skills and precautions. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the wilderness, Derek proudly landed a large salmon, its silvery body thrashing against the current, a catch worth remembering. But the scent of the fish, carried on the breeze, caught the attention of a predator. A grizzly bear, driven by hunger, emerged from the forest with startling speed. Its massive frame, cloaked in thick brown fur, moved with unsettling silence. Though Derek and Tyler had remained vigilant, the bear's sudden appearance froze them in place, shattering the tranquility of the day in an instant. The grizzly's eyes locked onto the salmon Derek had just caught, its instincts overriding any sense of caution. The bear's charging roar shattered the stillness of the river, sending a wave of terror through the two men. Tyler froze, his mind racing, but Derek, ever the quick thinker, grabbed the flare gun he had kept within reach. His hands shook as he aimed the weapon at the bear, trying to scare it off with the bright flash and loud noise the flare would produce. He fired, the flare shooting into the air in a burst of blinding light, but the bear did not falter. Instead, it charged with even greater fury, its powerful legs propelling it forward in a terrifying surge. Derek had no time to react. The bear closed the distance in an instant, slamming into him with the force of a freight train. The impact knocked him off his feet and sent him crashing into the river with a violent splash. The cold water bit at his skin, but it was nothing compared to the agony of being struck by the bear's claws. The grizzly followed him into the river, its massive body now on top of Derek, its claws raking through his flesh. Derek's attempts to fight back were futile. His body was weakened by the force of the bear's blows. Tyler, heart racing in horror, realized that his friend was in immediate danger. He knew he couldn't take on the bear himself, so he did the only thing he could think of. He turned and began to climb a nearby tree, hoping to escape the bear's reach. The tree was tall and sturdy, its branches offering a precarious perch just out of the bear's path. Tyler's breath was shallow, his pulse racing, but he managed to pull himself into the tree, watching helplessly as the bear continued its assault on Derek. From his vantage point, he could see the grizzly's ferocity, the animal's powerful jaws snapping and its claws slashing at his friend. Derek's screams echoed through the river valley, each one more desperate than the last. The struggle seemed to go on forever, but to Tyler, it was as if time had slowed to a crawl. The bear was relentless, its attack never ceasing, its strength overwhelming. Tyler, paralyzed by fear and helplessness, could do nothing but watch as Derek's body was tossed and battered by the bear's brutal onslaught. He wanted to act, to do something, but he was trapped in the tree, unable to help his friend in any meaningful way. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the bear, apparently satisfied or momentarily distracted, retreated back into the forest, its immense body disappearing into the trees as quickly as it had arrived. Tyler, shaking with terror and exhaustion, descended from the tree as quickly as he could. His heart was pounding, but he couldn't bring himself to hesitate. He had to get to Derek. As he reached the riverbank, he saw his friend's battered body, half submerged in the water, lifeless and still. The horror of the scene hit him like a physical blow. Derek's injuries were severe, his body torn apart by the bear's claws and teeth. Tyler rushed to Derek's side, his hands trembling as he tried to drag his friend out of the water, but it was already too late. Despite his best efforts, Derek had succumbed to his injuries, his life stolen by the brutal attack. Tyler, overcome with grief and disbelief, held his friend's body as tears streamed down his face. The loss was overwhelming. His lifelong friend, a man he had shared so many adventures with, was gone in an instant. Tyler's heart weighed heavy as he knew he had to seek help. Leaving his friend behind in the river, he began the grueling journey to the nearest ranger station. The forest felt endless, its vastness oppressive, and each step pressed down on him with the weight of loss. His mind raced, thoughts fragmented, but instinct drove him forward. Hours later, Tyler reached the station, exhausted and shaken. A rescue team was dispatched to the river, but by the time they arrived, Derek was lost. The bear had disappeared, but its trail was quickly found. After a tense standoff, the bear was located deep in the forest and euthanized. It was no longer a threat, but the tragedy left its mark on all involved. Derek Bennett's death and Tyler's attack sent shockwaves through the community. Experts issued warnings about the dangers of fishing in bear habitats, emphasizing the need for safety precautions. Tyler's escape from the bear's assault was praised, but the incident served as a stark reminder of the risks of venturing into bear country unprepared. The loss of Derek would haunt Tyler forever, no doubt. Megan Torres, 29, was an experienced and avid runner, accustomed to the wild terrains that crisscross the outskirts of the wilderness of Wyoming. She had spent many years running on remote trails, finding peace in the solitude and the rhythm of her footfalls. The dense forests, rocky paths, and mountain air were the perfect escape from her busy life. On the morning of the attack, she had set out for one of her regular routes, a remote trail that wound through a series of narrow ravines and open meadows, far from the usual tourist crowds. It was an area she knew well, and it felt like a sanctuary to her. A place where the world's demands faded away with every mile she ran. The sun had only just risen, and the early morning mist clung to the trees, making the trail seem even more isolated and mysterious. Megan's pace was steady, her breaths measured as she moved deeper into the wilderness. She had no concern for predators. She had jogged these paths countless times, and while she knew bears were present in the area, she trusted her knowledge of safety protocols and the natural rhythms of the park. She kept her ears alert for the sounds of wildlife and her eyes scanning the trail ahead, but for the most part, her focus was on the path beneath her feet. However, as she rounded a sharp bend in the path, she unknowingly entered the territory of a grizzly bear. The animal, disturbed from its foraging by the sudden appearance of a human, was caught off guard. Grizzly bears, especially mothers with cubs or those with a recent kill nearby, could react aggressively to perceived threats, and Megan's sudden and unannounced presence on the trail was enough to trigger the bear's instincts. The grizzly, hidden in a thick thicket, was startled by the quick motion of her feet and her rapid approach. In a split second, it lunged from the brush with terrifying speed. Megan's mind barely had time to process the movement before the bear was upon her. Its massive form, powerful and swift, collided with her in a rush of force, knocking her off her feet and sending her sprawling to the ground. Her body hit the trail hard, the air driven from her lungs as she fell. The shock of the impact left her disoriented, and she struggled to regain her bearings as the bear loomed over her. Its eyes, wild and full of primal fear, locked onto her as it moved in to assert dominance over the unexpected intruder. Terrified but refusing to give in to panic, Megan tried to push herself up, but the bear was already swiping at her with its massive paws. The first blow struck her legs, sending searing pain through her body. Her muscles screamed in protest as the bear's claws raked deep into her flesh, tearing through the fabric of her shorts and into her skin. The grizzly's attack was relentless, its powerful limbs battering her torso and legs with brutal efficiency. Trembling with fear and pain, Megan fought desperately to protect herself, instinctively curling into a ball in an attempt to shield her vital organs. But her efforts were in vain. The bear, driven by hunger or territorial instincts, continued to maul her, sinking its teeth into her side, the sharp pain of the bite radiating through her body. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, and every movement she made to try to push the bear away was met with more violence. She could feel the weight of the animal pressing down on her, its massive body holding her in place while it tore into her flesh. The sharp crunch of bone echoed in her ears as the bear's claws dug deeper into her skin. Megan's heart raced, and despite the overwhelming pain, she refused to stop moving, knowing that any hesitation could lead to fatal consequences. Her legs, though gravely injured, managed to kick out in desperation, hitting the bear's side. But the blow did little to deter the animal. It was relentless, its jaws snapping at her as she tried to protect her vital organs. In that moment, Megan's thoughts raced. She had learned the importance of playing dead in bear encounters, but she also knew that the attack was already in full force. Playing dead wasn't an option when the bear was so close, so she fought on, driven by sheer will. She had heard stories of people who had survived bear attacks by refusing to surrender. She refused to be another statistic. Luckily, in her desperate state, Megan was not alone. A hiker, John Walker, 56, who had been several miles ahead on the same trail, heard the screams from the direction of the attack. The sound of her terror echoed through the trees, reaching John's ears and drawing him toward the scene. With no time to waste, he scrambled to reach Megan, moving quickly despite his age. When he finally arrived, his eyes fell on the horrific sight of the grizzly mauling her. John acted instinctively, reaching into his pack for a bear horn he carried as part of his safety gear. He blew the horn with all his might, the sharp sound cutting through the air and startling the bear. The loud, shrill blast echoed in the forest, and the grizzly, momentarily distracted by the noise, stopped its attack. Megan, bloodied and badly injured, lay motionless on the ground as the bear turned its attention elsewhere. The animal, momentarily confused by the intrusion, hesitated and then retreated back into the brush, disappearing into the forest as quickly as it had come. John rushed to Megan's side, his mind racing as he assessed her injuries. She was gravely wounded, her body covered in deep gashes, and her legs were mangled. Blood soaked her clothes, but she was alive, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. John quickly called for help, using his emergency communication device to alert authorities and request an airlift. The nearest ranger station was miles away, but he knew the urgency of the situation. The seconds felt like hours as he kept pressure on her wounds, trying to keep her conscious and stable. Rescue teams arrived as quickly as possible, with a helicopter airlifting Megan to a nearby hospital. By the time they reached the hospital, her injuries were so severe that she was immediately rushed into surgery. The medical team worked tirelessly to repair the damage to her legs and torso, and although her recovery would be long and difficult, she survived the attack. Wildlife officers tracked down the grizzly bear, which had fled into the forest. After a thorough search, it was located and euthanized for being too dangerous. The bear's aggression was triggered by Megan's sudden presence, though it acted on instinct. The attack underscored the risks of jogging in bear habitats without proper precautions. In the wake of the attack, discussions on bear safety intensified. Experts stressed the importance of carrying deterrents like bear horns or spray, and warned against running alone in bear-prone areas. Megan's survival, thanks to John's quick actions, highlighted the need for preparedness when encountering wildlife. The incident prompted increased safety measures and greater efforts to educate outdoor enthusiasts on avoiding and responding to bear encounters. The Bitterroot Wilderness, nestled in the western part of Montana, was a vast and rugged expanse of forested mountains, deep ravines, and flowing rivers. Known for its dense wildlife population, the area was a hunter's paradise, attracting seasoned outdoorsmen from all over the country. Kyle Anderson, 33, was no stranger to these wild lands. As an experienced hunter, he had spent years tracking game through the vast stretches of wilderness, always respecting the dangers it harbored. With his rifle slung over his shoulder and a sharp eye for tracking, Kyle was well prepared for his latest hunt, an elk that had been spotted several miles into the heart of the Bitterroots. Kyle's partner on this trip, Ben, 38, had been hunting alongside him for years. Though their preferences differed, Ben often preferred the high alpine regions, while Kyle was more at home in the dense lowland forests. They shared a deep knowledge of the land and a healthy respect for the unpredictable nature of wildlife. They had planned this trip meticulously, bringing with them the necessary tools for safety and survival in bear country, knowing that grizzly bears roamed these parts. Both men understood the risks of hunting in the wilderness, but the promise of a large elk made the journey worth it. The day had begun like any other hunt. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the forest floor, as Kyle picked his way through the underbrush, following the trail of the elk. He was focused on his task, his eyes scanning the ground for signs of the animal's movement. The thrill of the hunt was evident in his movements. Quick, quiet, and deliberate. He had no intention of rushing. The elk was elusive, and he needed patience. Unbeknownst to Kyle, however, he had wandered too far off course. While concentrating on the elk's trail, he had unknowingly entered an area frequented by bears. A grizzly had recently been scavenging on a carcass, and its keen sense of smell caught the faint scent of Kyle's presence. Hungry and territorial, the bear was near the edge of a small clearing when it first detected the human odor. Kyle's cautious approach had unknowingly placed him on a collision course with the bear. The animal, disturbed from its meal, began to move through the trees, its massive form gliding silently but with terrifying purpose. Kyle, completely unaware of the bear's proximity, continued to follow the elk trail. It wasn't until he heard a loud rustling in the trees behind him that he finally realized something was wrong. Instinctively, he turned toward the sound, his heart racing as his eyes caught the massive shape of the bear emerging from the shadows. The bear was large, easily weighing several hundred pounds, and its presence was unmistakable. For a split second, the two locked eyes, and Kyle felt the chilling sense of being prey. He instinctively took a step back, but it was already too late. In a flash, the grizzly charged, covering the distance between them with terrifying speed. Kyle barely had time to raise his rifle before the bear slammed into him, knocking him to the ground. The impact was so intense that the breath was driven from his lungs. Pain exploded in his legs as the bear's claws raked through the fabric of his hunting pants, tearing into his flesh. The weight of the grizzly was suffocating, and for a brief moment Kyle's world was nothing but pain and chaos as the animal mauled his legs with brutal efficiency. His rifle was knocked from his grasp, and the once hopeful plan of defending himself seemed hopeless in an instant. Despite the searing pain, Kyle knew he needed to act fast. His mind raced, clouded by the shock of the attack, but his training kicked in. With a desperate, trembling hand, he reached for his rifle. He knew it was his only chance, the one weapon that might save him from a grisly death. His fingers fumbled over the stock, the pain from his legs making every movement feel like an eternity. As he finally grasped the rifle, he brought it to his shoulder with agonizing slowness. The bear, sensing the danger, continued its assault, its jaws snapping at Kyle's legs as it tried to overpower him. In his panic, Kyle squeezed the trigger, but nothing happened. The rifle jammed. His heart sank, and for a fleeting moment all hope seemed lost. The bear's claws dug deeper into his flesh, and the pain became unbearable. But in the distance, faintly, he heard a sound, footsteps crunching through the underbrush, followed by the distinct crack of a branch snapping. Ben had heard the commotion. He had heard the sounds of the bear's charge and Kyle's cries, and now he was rushing toward the scene. Ben arrived just as Kyle was struggling to stay conscious. He saw the grizzly on top of his friend, tearing into his legs with terrifying ferocity. Without thinking, Ben raised his own rifle and fired a warning shot into the air. The sharp sound of the gunshot startled the bear, causing it to pause in its attack. For a brief moment, the bear hesitated, its eyes darting between Ben and Kyle. The distraction was enough. Sensing danger from the new arrival, the bear began to retreat, its massive form disappearing into the woods as quickly as it had appeared. Ben hurried to Kyle's side, quickly assessing the damage. Blood pooled around Kyle's mangled left leg, torn apart by the bear's claws. Acting fast, Ben applied first aid to stop the bleeding with the limited supplies in his pack. Carefully, he helped Kyle to his feet and began the slow, arduous trek out of the wilderness. The journey was brutal. Kyle, weakened by blood loss, struggled to move, while Ben pushed forward despite his own exhaustion. After hours of effort, they reached a clearing and signaled for help. A rescue team, alerted by Ben's earlier radio call, arrived shortly after. Kyle was airlifted to a medical facility where doctors stabilized him, but the damage to his leg was extensive. Recovery would take weeks, and his hunting days were over, but he survived. The bear was never found, likely retreating deeper into the forest. The attack reignited discussions on firearm reliability and improved bear deterrence, urging hunters to stay alert in grizzly territory.